to the third installment of Soluna's AMA series, where we answer questions, some of our audience's most frequently asked questions. And thanks to everyone who's responded to our questions on social media and sent them in today. I'm John Belizaire, CEO of Soluna Computing, and I'm here with Michael Dvorak, CEO of Soluna Holdings, our parent company. Thanks for joining me again, Michael.
My pleasure as always. It's good to be back.
And it's great to be back. Since the last AMA we posted sometime in June, a lot has changed in the market. We're certainly amid a pretty steep, current sort of crypto price action downturn, if whatever you want to call it. We're seeing certainly the increasing urgency for regulation in the crypto mining and energy space. We're seeing a huge influx of interest, around our brand and so forth as well. Naturally, we've gotten lots of questions in regards to these trends as a result. So I'd like to just jump right in. I'm going to turn the mic over to Michael, who will start the first series of questions that we're getting from some of our folks. Michael?
Thank you, John. Let's begin with developments in Texas and some of the mining regulations, or really power regulations around that. John asked, I'm curious if Michael or John could comment on the recent ERCOT ruling affecting behind the meter and front of the meter sales and its potential effect on Soluna's power costs. With the new ruling, could the company receive actually lower power costs than the 2.5 cents that you guys were talking about? So, John, I'll tee you up to answer that.
Yeah, I assume John, the Soluna fan here, is asking about the new ERCOT large load task force, or the large load process. So when we started our journey into the ERCOT realm and started building our projects behind the meter, as everybody knows, we do solar, wind, and hydro behind the meter. And there was really no process for interconnecting our load to the power plant and getting ERCOT to approve that. What the project had to do is actually register with ERCOT that they were adding load to their facility, such that ERCOT can update their model. ERCOT has a model of all the resources on
So, John,
the grid.
just for the sake of everybody out there, what does ERCOT do in ERCOT's mission for a minute?
So ERCOT is responsible for managing the grid in Texas. So people confuse ERCOT with a utility, but it's more of like a power administration, if you will.
Okay.
All of the large independent systems operating companies, it's another way of saying grid networks, if you will. It just so happens that Texas is its own grid. It's not interconnected to anything. It's sort of, islanded, and that grid infrastructure is managed by the ERCOT
So,
administration, if you
who
will.
owns ERCOT? Who's in charge of ERCOT, and what's
It's a
their
government
mandate?
agency. It's a state agency that's focused on managing and implementing all of the protocols and operations of the ERCOT interconnection and
So,
grid system.
they're like a traffic cop setting traffic rules for the grid. Is that a good analogy?
Yeah, that's right. In New York, it's NISO and the New York Power Authority that do something
Okay,
similar. Every state and
got
region
it,
has one,
got it, got it.
and they're a regulated entity. They report into the head of state uh, and are responsible for the grid infrastructure. And grid infrastructure is a core, almost a vital organ to every state,
Got
right?
it.
And so it's important that
Okay,
it's part of the state's infrastructure. So ERCOT is the Texas version of that. And um, sometime in the spring, a large number of submissions started to come into the ERCOT system, uh, asking for rights to interconnect loads to the facility. Load is, a data center or a mining operation, and a lot of this was front of the meter. So someone went to a large plot of land, they built a new substation, and in collaboration with a local utility. There's a difference between ERCOT and the local utility that actually retail sells you power. Okay. And they build their facility, and then they want to interconnect that facility to the substation and buy power and source power, through the retail. And ERCOT's got to approve that because it's a new element to the grid. So
Got
imagine
it.
you're sitting in this big room, and there's like a map of the state, and on that map of the state is like the entire grid system sort of sketched on it, right? And there's blinking lights of all the stuff that's out there. There's generators, there's users of power, all that kind of stuff, and you're adding a new one. ERCOT has to know that thing is happening, so you've got to register to do that.
Got it.
So there's a
What
process
exactly
for
happened
doing
in
that.
March exactly?
So
So
it's March 25th, I believe, March 25th that
okay.
happened.
So
So they
what happened?
issued a notice.
Okay.
So they saw so many of these things, and imagine there's a planning committee that gets these things, and they're usually used to seeing one to two, or a handful of them coming in, and they schedule them into their annual process, which usually takes place once a year. And then they sort of expect these loads to be built out because they're usually like large facilities, like think about a big refinery or something like that that's being built, and they figured it takes a year to build it, right? And all of these retail companies are saying, "Oh yeah, I have a customer. It's a big refinery. They're going to be coming online next year, so we're going to need 100 megawatts of power or something like that." Okay, and so ERCOT says, "Great, we'll just put that into our annual process, and when you guys are built, we should be ready to receive you." Okay, but what happened in the last 18 months, as billions of dollars went into the crypto space, ERCOT started getting a lot of these things, and they were saying, this thing's going to energize next month or or 3 months from now, and they've never seen anything like that. And so they took a step back and said, wait a minute. And by the way, there was hundreds of megawatts approaching a gigawatt of this. And so they said, we've got to create a new process because these loads are coming online much faster than our normal process, which takes 1 to 2 years, you see.
Mhm.
So they put
Okay.
together a new interim load, what they call interim large load interconnection process, which became effective immediately. And the process basically applies to any interconnection request that's usually a large flexible load with really fast timelines. So if you got like something that's going to come on really fast, like a crypto miner, then they have to, and they haven't yet had a chance to model it in. So they have this software system that models the whole grid, so they know that their grid will not have any kind of reliability issues. Okay. So if they haven't had a chance to model it in and study it to understand what it is and how it works and everything, then they need to enter this process into the planning process. And they have a special team that's focused on dealing with these loads, and they do a planning assessment where they look at the regional transmission plan. Do we have more power lines being built in that area? Look at a full study, all the different aspects of the actual equipment that's being added to the grid. And then they do like a sort of regional planning review, if you will. And the way the process works is um, if you have a load that has a total demand within a 2-year period of 75 megawatts or greater, then you've got to go through this process. If you have a load that is 20 megawatts or greater, then you've got to go through this process. If it's below those thresholds, then you don't have to go through the
And the
process.
75 and 25 is 75 is not co-located, and the 20 megawatts is co-located with another resource. Is that
You got it. So 75 megawatts means you're by yourself. You've built that substation like I talked about on this nice empty plot of land. Is your substation, or you borrowed somebody else's or whatever. And so it's viewed as front of the meter. That's 75. And if you're behind the meter, it's a 20 megawatt threshold. Behind the meter means you're interconnected with a existing resource like another power plant,
so?
say, which falls
John,
which is
help me understand
category.
how this affects Soluna and very specifically Soluna's Dorothy project.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So Dorothy was basically right at the point where it was ready to submit what's called a RIO process. there are some key aspects to the process. One is you've got to submit a bunch of studies to ERCOT for the new load. And what you need to be able to show them is you're not going to affect in any way their ability to reserve power for when their grid needs it. You're not going to put a strain on their transmission networks. You're not going to have electrons going backwards and into the grid when you're supposed to be pulling it down. So there's all these very technical studies that they have to do. And some of those studies, by the way, are federally required. So they're compliance reasons. When they add resources to your grid, you have to make sure that the grid will be resilient and not break down. Okay. Then you have to submit your metering design. How are the meters laid out over there? Who owns them, et cetera. And then you have to update what's called a resource integration and operations services data plan. All that's just a sophisticated way of saying, hey, according to our little map here, there's just a power plant at this location. And now you're going to send them, you're going to go to the software and update it and say, actually, there's a power plant, and then there's 50 megawatts of load back here or 100 megawatts of load back here as well. And then that allows them to update the system such that they know electrons flow in and out over there, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the three core elements of the process. And when we were we started building the site out and we were about to submit, that's when this process change took place.
Okay.
So we entered that process along with lots of other folks. And
how much is it with other folks? 500 megawatts, a gigawatt.
I've heard mention of approaching a gigawatt of
Okay.
these projects. And by the way, some of the submissions are speculative in nature, meaning people are just seeing if they could get access to energy at that
So they,
particular
they just
location.
they didn't really have a project spec. They
They
just
don't have
threw
a
in the
project
paper,
exactly,
right? Not like us where
and
we're
right.
building.
And ERCOT is treating them all the
Okay.
same, so that slows the process down.
Okay.
So there was so much volume of this, and as all of our listeners may or may not know, ERCOT has some bruises, right? They had the big winter storm a couple years ago. They've had lots of grid stability issues with the recent temperature changes down there, and so they've actually lost people. They've had some attrition issues. People have left ERCOT, and so the resources need to process all of these submissions after they introduced the process was limited, and so it's taken them time to kind of go through it. But the nice thing is that there is a process, so it's not like you're going to ERCOT and begging and pleading. If your project doesn't create any issues, right, then your project will eventually be approved on some parameters, if you will. And some projects are more problematic than others because when they model it, they see that there's a lot of contention for the resources and they don't have enough transmission and so forth. So a lot of it is determining what effect this new
So
load
I want to
has on the
stop you
grid.
there for a minute. So if I'm them and I'm looking at Dorothy,
Right.
is it in an area where there's congestion and a lot of problems, or how would you characterize it from their perspective?
Yeah. So they're going to look at transmission. So is there enough pipe to send energy out at a certain amount and draw in energy at a certain amount? So the simplest way to think about it is in our particular location, we're building behind a facility that's able to produce approaching 200 megawatts of power, and so that facility would not have been built unless the transmission lines are designed to be able to carry that power down the ERCOT system. So the lines are certainly big enough to draw down 100 megawatts to our facility.
Okay.
And as long as there isn't competing, like there's another, there's lots of other 100 plus megawatt facilities close to us that would also start to congest that line, then technically it should go through. So a lot
So
of those
from what you
studies,
know about what else is in our area, are there
there's,
many things in contention for that line?
uh, no, there's many, many, many times less load than the load that we're adding because it's mostly agricultural industries out there
Okay.
where we're located, and we're probably the largest load that area has seen in a while, and that's why a lot of the design of our facility was to be flexible if those members of the community need energy, we can back down our footprint, etc. So there's nothing, at least from Soluna's perspective, that we see that would cause our facility to not, to cause any problems for the grid at that particular location, or get eventually approved as part of this process.
So, quote unquote,
And
problems are really location dependent. So, depending on where
absolutely,
you
yes,
are, so you're saying
yeah,
is Soluna is in a sufficiently remote, not
remote,
congested
exactly,
area where it's unlikely that ERCOT could come back and say, hey, you're in a congested area, your project size is shrunk, or we're not interested in you having it here because it would make the grid unstable. It's,
right.
it's
Now, having said that, ERCOT may decide that they still want us to phase in because they just want to see there's a model and then there's reality, right?
right.
In terms of like what happens. So they tend to take a conservative posture. So they may say, okay, you're approved to ramp up to 100 megawatts, but we want you to do it in 20 to 25 megawatt chunks, so that we can see to make sure that all the studies we did, there was no
Right. And
issues.
that would be perfectly
And
consistent with the way we ramp up anyway.
exactly, that's why we're pretty um, we're pretty confident, and with some of these processes you just never know, but at the same time I think that we understand it enough. This is an engineering problem, and we're giving them all the information they need, and the transmission providers need to do their studies and their assessment, and so far it's been moving along quite well.
Okay. Understood. So I'm not going to try to nail you down on timing, um,
Okay, thank you.
but we can at least get 20 megawatts rolling behind the meter when we're ready. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. So if we're below that threshold, we can energize 20 because we're behind the meter using the process, and then the broader footprint of our facility can begin to ramp up later, and that's what a lot of our planning is built around. That we'll probably see something like that.
Okay, that's
But
great.
ERCOT gets to decide. They may unlock more than that.
Right.
It's really about what issues they see there. If they don't see any issues, then you know they may be more expansive in terms of what they allow us to energize.
I appreciate that. I know it was a bit of a fulsome explanation, but I think it's really important our investors have a good understanding of this. And
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important. It's a great question that it's coming because it's been a bit opaque about the what's happening in the
right,
market. It's all positive, though. I think folks should understand. ERCOT made this protocol change, which allows this to happen, and they're essentially doing the next step, which is to update their processes, look at how these resources can help them with grid flexibility, engaging. So they actually there's very lots of collaboration with ERCOT and these participants to understand how this technology works. So there's a lot of learning that they're doing as well, because normally they're used to just seeing batteries back there, right, or big factories or refineries, and so this new computing infrastructure is new to them, and we've all tried to be helpful to help them ramp up as
great,
quickly as possible on understanding it.
great, super. Appreciate it. Okay, going to shift gears a little bit and ask
Hmm.
you that some people have been talking about the implication of Congress investigating environmental and energy impacts of Bitcoin mining. A certain senator named Elizabeth Warren and others are asking Congress to crack down on crypto mining. So somebody asked,
Mm.
do you believe that regulation or energy reporting requirements are in the future? And how do you think that would happen and affect Soluna's business model?
Well, I think overall, the industry is continuing to mature. Um, in the last year, we've seen lots of narratives around the negative externalities of Bitcoin. A lot of it is wrong, actually. I think what we believe here at Soluna is that Bitcoin can have a very powerful catalyzing effect to the growth of renewable energy, and that's what we're focused on. Now, regulation will have to play a role. especially what's happened in the last few months around some of the crypto projects and the crypto banks. And when you look at mining in general, people again still don't understand how this all fits in and how it's going to help the grid. We're doing the best that we can to educate. But I think the point that folks should understand is that regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. The right regulation can actually, dissuade bad actors and benefit the long-term health of the industry by implementing standards that we all have to comply with. That again, the right set of standards which allow us to ensure that we're building these facilities in a sustainable way. We're uh, injecting load into the grid in a way that protects it. And I think that the legislation that the senator is talking about in particular, which is this idea of sort of disclosing energy use and carbon emissions, could incentivize more mining companies to transition to renewable energy, like we've been focused on from day one, which would be a positive investment or positive development for the industry, I think. And we think that there are pages you can pull from other sustainability industries that can help our industry begin to be viewed in a positive way as a real resource to catalyze the grid. The New York mining bill, which was viewed to be a sort of moratorium or fossil fuel based mining companies, and within the state, is sort of another example of legislation that could help dissuade bad actors that are re-energizing legacy fuels and preventing the grid from getting to the transition that it wants to get to. So I think that we will see how regulation takes shape. We are not we're a technology company, so we're not writing laws, but it would be helpful to have regulation that essentially incentivizes the very thing that our mission is focused on, and that is
Right.
to drive more renewables.
Got it. Helpful. Thank you, John.